Unit 10. Enforcement and Violations. The enforcement framework and legal authority. Effective enforcement is essential for successful floodplain management and for maintaining community eligibility in the National Flood Insurance Programme. Communities have both the authority and the obligation to enforce their floodplain management ordinances, and failure to do so can result in serious consequences, including suspension from NFIP. The legal authority for floodplain management enforcement comes from the community's police powers, which allow local governments to regulate activities that affect public health, safety, and welfare. This authority is typically established through the adoption of floodplain management ordinances that specify prohibited activities, permit requirements, and enforcement procedures. The floodplain administrator is typically designated as the primary enforcement official, though other community officials may also have enforcement responsibilities. The floodplain administrator must have the legal authority to issue permits, conduct inspections, issue violation notices, and initiate enforcement actions. Enforcement authority must be clearly defined in the community's ordinance and must include specific procedures for addressing violations. The ordinance should specify what constitutes a violation, what enforcement actions are available, and what procedures must be followed when taking enforcement action. Due process requirements apply to all enforcement actions and must be carefully followed to ensure that enforcement actions are legally valid. Property owners must be given adequate notice of violations and must have opportunities to respond before final enforcement actions are taken. Violation discovery and investigation. Violations can be discovered through various means, including routine inspections, complaint investigations, aerial photography review, and observation during other community activities. The floodplain administrator should establish systematic procedures for identifying potential violations and should train other community staff to recognize and report potential problems. Construction inspections are one of the most important tools for preventing violations. Regular inspections during different phases of construction can identify problems early when they are easier and less expensive to correct. Inspections should be documented with photographs and written reports. Complaint investigations require prompt response and thorough documentation. Complaints may come from neighbors, insurance companies, FEMA, or other sources. Each complaint should be investigated promptly and thoroughly, with findings documented in writing. Aerial photography and satellite imagery can be valuable tools for identifying unpermitted development or changes to flood-prone areas. Many communities conduct periodic reviews of aerial imagery to identify potential violations that might not be visible from ground level. Post-flood inspections are particularly important for identifying substantial damage situations and for documenting flood impacts that might affect future development decisions. These inspections should be conducted as soon as safely possible after flood events. Types of violations and common scenarios. Development without permits is probably the most common floodplain management violation. This includes construction of buildings, placement of fill, installation of manufactured homes, and other development activities that require permits but were undertaken without proper authorization. Inadequate elevation is another common violation, occurring when buildings are constructed below the required base flood elevation. This might result from misreading the flood map, using incorrect elevation data, or failing to account for settlement of fill materials. Unauthorized fill placement, particularly in floodways, creates serious violations because it can affect flood levels over large areas. Fill violations might involve building pads, driveways, landscaping, or other activities that change ground elevations in flood-prone areas. Improper foundation construction includes violations such as using non-compliant foundation types, failing to provide required flood openings, or constructing crawl spaces that do not meet regulatory requirements. Utility violations involve placement of heating, cooling, electrical or plumbing systems below the base flood elevation without proper protection. These violations are often discovered during inspections or after flood events. Substantial improvement violations occur when property owners fail to recognize that their improvements trigger compliance requirements, or when they attempt to avoid these requirements by underestimating improvement costs or market values. Storage violations in floodways involve placement of materials, equipment, or vehicles in areas where they could obstruct flood flows or become debris during flood events. Manufactured home violations include placement on non-permanent foundations, inadequate tie-down systems, or failure to elevate to required levels. Enforcement tools and procedures. Stop work orders are immediate enforcement tools used to halt construction activities that violate floodplain regulations. These orders should be issued promptly when serious violations are discovered and should specify exactly what work must be stopped and what conditions must be met before work can resume. Violation notices are formal notifications to property owners that violations have occurred and that corrective action is required. These notices should describe the violation in detail, specify what actions are required for compliance, and establish deadlines for corrective action. Civil penalties and fines can be effective enforcement tools, particularly for repeat violations or when property owners are unresponsive to other enforcement efforts. The ordinance should specify the amounts of penalties and the procedures for imposing them. Permit revocation may be appropriate when permits were improperly issued or when construction under permits violates approved plans. Revoked permits cannot be reinstated until violations are corrected and proper approvals are obtained. Legal action through the court system may be necessary for serious violations or when property owners refuse to comply with violation notices. Legal action should be coordinated with the community's attorney and should follow established legal procedures. Red tagging or condemnation procedures may be used for structures that pose immediate safety hazards due to improper construction or flood damage. These procedures typically prevent occupancy until safety issues are resolved. Denial of utilities or certificates of occupancy can be effective enforcement tools for new construction that does not meet regulatory requirements. These actions prevent use of non-compliant structures until violations are corrected. Documentation and record-keeping. Thorough documentation is essential for effective enforcement and for defending enforcement actions if they are challenged in court. Documentation should begin as soon as violations are discovered and should continue throughout the enforcement process. Photographs are among the most important types of enforcement documentation. Photos should show the violation clearly, should include reference points for scale and location, and should be dated and properly identified. Before, during, and after photos be particularly valuable for showing the progression of enforcement actions. Written reports should document all aspects of violation discovery, investigation, and enforcement. Reports should be objective, factual, and complete, and should include dates, times, people contacted, actions taken, and responses received. Surveys and elevation data may be necessary to document violations involving improper elevations or unauthorized fill placement. Professional surveys may be required to establish exact elevations and to provide legally defensible documentation. Correspondence with property owners should be maintained in organized files that show the complete history of enforcement actions. This includes violation notices, property owner responses, extension requests, compliance documentation, and any legal proceedings. Site visits and inspections should be documented with written reports that describe conditions observed, actions taken, and follow-up requirements. Inspection reports should be signed and dated by the inspector and should be maintained in organized files. Legal documentation for court proceedings must meet specific legal requirements and should be prepared with assistance from the community's attorney. This documentation may include affidavits, expert testimony, and other materials needed for legal proceedings. Working with property owners. Successful enforcement often depends on effective communication with property owners who may not understand regulatory requirements or who may be facing genuine difficulties in achieving compliance. A cooperative approach is often more effective than adversarial enforcement. Education and technical assistance should be provided to help property owners understand what is required for compliance and how to achieve it. Many violations result from misunderstanding rather than willful non-compliance. Reasonable deadlines for compliance should be established based on the nature of the violation and the complexity of required corrective actions. Simple violations might be corrected quickly, While complex structural issues may require months to resolve properly, extension requests should be evaluated based on legitimate need and demonstrated good faith efforts to comply. Extensions may be appropriate when property owners are making progress toward compliance, but need additional time due to circumstances beyond their control. Professional assistance may be needed to determine appropriate corrective actions for complex violations. Communities may need to require property owners to hire engineers, surveyors, or other professionals to develop compliance solutions. Financial considerations may affect enforcement approaches, particularly for substantial improvement situations or for violations involving major structural modifications. While economic hardship alone does not excuse violations, communities may need to consider practical approaches that achieve compliance over time. Voluntary compliance should always be the preferred approach when possible. Property owners who voluntarily correct violations often become advocates for proper floodplain management and may help educate other property owners about requirements. Insurance implications of violations. Violations of floodplain management requirements can have serious implications for flood insurance coverage and claims payments. Property owners should be informed about these implications as part of the enforcement process. Insurance policies may not cover flood damage to structures that were built in violation of floodplain management requirements. This can leave property owners with substantial uninsured losses after flood events. Rate increases may result from violations that increase flood risks. Properties that do not meet regulatory requirements may be subject to higher insurance rates that reflect their actual flood risk rather than subsidized rates. Claims may be denied or reduced for structures that violate floodplain management requirements. Insurance companies conduct detailed investigations after major flood events and may deny claims for non-compliant construction. Compliance requirements may need to be met before insurance coverage can be obtained or renewed. This creates additional incentives for property owners to correct violations promptly. Documentation of enforcement actions may be requested by insurance companies during claims investigations. Communities should maintain detailed records that can be provided to support or dispute insurance determinations, repeat violations, and escalating enforcement. Some property owners may ignore initial enforcement efforts or may repeatedly violate floodplain management requirements. These situations require escalating enforcement approaches and may ultimately require legal action. Progressive enforcement typically begins with education and warnings, progresses to formal violation notices and deadlines, and ultimately may require penalties, legal action, or other serious consequences. Repeat violators should face increasingly serious enforcement actions, including higher penalties, shorter compliance deadlines, and more intensive monitoring. The enforcement approach should escalate until compliance is achieved. Chronic violators may require special attention, including frequent inspections, coordination with other regulatory agencies, and consideration of more serious enforcement actions such as condemnation proceedings. Legal precedents may be important in dealing with repeat violators, particularly if enforcement actions are challenged in court. Communities should work with their attorneys to ensure that enforcement actions are legally sound and defensible. Community reputation for enforcement effectiveness can be important in preventing violations. When property owners understand that violations will be discovered and will result in serious consequences, voluntary compliance typically increases. Coordination with other agencies. Floodplain management enforcement often involves coordination with other regulatory agencies that have related jurisdiction or expertise. Building departments, health departments, environmental agencies, and others may have roles in addressing violations. Building code enforcement often overlaps with floodplain management, particularly for structural violations or situations involving substantial improvements. Coordination between these programs can improve effectiveness and reduce duplication. Environmental protection agencies may have jurisdiction over activities in wetlands, coastal areas, or other environmentally sensitive flood-prone areas. Coordination with these agencies can help ensure comprehensive protection. Legal coordination with prosecutors, attorneys, and courts is essential for enforcement actions that require legal proceedings. Community attorneys should be involved early in serious enforcement cases. Insurance coordination with insurance companies and agents can help ensure that violations are properly reflected in insurance coverage and rates. This coordination can also help identify violations through claims investigations. State coordination with state floodplain management agencies can provide technical assistance, legal support, and consistency with statewide enforcement approaches. Federal coordination with FEMA is important for violations that might affect community eligibility in NFIP or that might require federal technical assistance to resolve. Summary and exam preparation, most critical concepts for exam success. The FEMA 480 exam focuses heavily on practical application of floodplain management principles rather than just memorization of definitions. Understanding the interconnections between different concepts is crucial for success. The 50% substantial improvement rule appears in multiple contexts throughout the exam. You must understand how to calculate substantial improvement percentages, how the cumulative rule works over 5 years, how market value is determined, and what costs count toward the calculation. Practice several calculation examples until you can do them quickly and accurately. Base flood elevation compliance is fundamental to almost every aspect of floodplain management. Know that the lowest floor of residential buildings must be at or above the BFE. Understand what constitutes the lowest floor, and remember that utilities must also be elevated above the BFE. Floodway restrictions represent the most stringent regulatory requirements. Remember that the standard is no rise in base flood elevations, not low rise or minimal rise, but no rise at all. This applies to any encroachment, including fill structures or storage. Variance criteria must all be satisfied simultaneously. Economic hardship alone never justifies a variance. The hardship must be exceptional, not just expensive or inconvenient. Self-created hardships do not qualify for variances. Map reading skills are tested extensively. Know the difference between Zone A and Zone AE. Understand what the different coastal zones mean and be able to identify floodway boundaries on FIRMs. Practice reading actual flood maps until you are comfortable with all the symbols and designations. Community responsibilities for program administration are frequently tested. Communities must adopt and enforce ordinances, maintain records, conduct inspections, and take enforcement action when violations occur. Failure to meet these responsibilities can result in program sanctions. Calculation practice problems. Here are key calculation types you must master. Substantial improvement calculation. A house worth $200,000 is having $85,000 in improvements. What percentage is this? Answer: $85,000 divided by $200,000 equals 42.5%. Since this is less than 50%, substantial improvement requirements do not apply. Cumulative improvement calculation. Year 1, $30,000 improvements. Year 3, $25,000 improvements. Year 5, $20,000 improvements. House value, $140,000. Total improvements, $75,000. Percentage, $75,000 divided by $140,000 equals 53.6%. This exceeds 50%, so substantial improvement requirements apply. Flood opening calculation. A crawl space is 30 feet by 40 feet, equals 1,200 square feet. Required flood openings, 1,200 square inches minimum, with at least 2 openings on different walls and the bottom of openings within 1 foot of grade. Freeboard calculation. Base flood elevation is 108 feet. Community requires 2 feet of freeboard. Minimum lowest floor elevation, 108 plus 2 equals 110 feet above sea level. Common exam mistakes to avoid. Do not confuse substantial improvement with substantial damage. Substantial improvement is voluntary improvements totaling 50% or more of market value. Substantial damage is involuntary damage totaling 50% or more of market value. Both trigger the same compliance requirements. Do not forget about the cumulative rule for substantial improvements. Multiple smaller improvements over 5 years can add up to trigger requirements even if no single improvement reaches 50%. Do not mix up flood zones. Zone A has no base flood elevations shown. Zone AE has base flood elevations. Zone V and VE are coastal high hazard areas with wave action. Zone X is outside the special flood hazard area. Do not assume basements are prohibited everywhere in flood zones. They are allowed but are restricted to parking, access and storage uses only, and they must meet specific construction requirements. Do not forget that the substantial improvement rule applies to the entire building, not just the part being improved. If you are adding a room and the addition cost triggers substantial improvement, the whole house must be brought into compliance. Do not confuse LOMAs with LOMRs. LOMAs remove properties from flood zones when they are on naturally high ground. LOMRs revise maps when physical changes or better data justify changes to flood hazard information. Do not think variances are easy to get. All 5 criteria must be met, and economic hardship alone is never sufficient. Variances are rare and are granted only in exceptional circumstances. Final review strategy. Focus your final review on the areas that carry the most weight on the exam. Substantial improvement calculations, BFE compliance requirements, floodway restrictions, variance criteria, and map reading skills. Create flashcards for key definitions, but do not just memorize them. Understand how they apply in practical situations. The exam tests application more than memorization. Practice reading actual FIRMs until you are comfortable identifying zones, base flood elevations, floodway boundaries, and cross-section locations. FEMA's Map Service Center has maps you can practice with. Review enforcement tools and procedures, including stop work orders, violation notices, penalties, and legal action. Understand that enforcement is essential for maintaining community eligibility in NFIP. Study the insurance basics, including waiting periods, coverage types, and the relationship between building compliance and insurance rates. Non-compliant construction may result in higher rates or denial of claims. Work through substantial improvement calculations until you can do them quickly and accurately. This is one of the most tested concepts on the exam. Remember that FEMA 480 is about practical application of floodplain management principles. Think about how the concepts work together in real-world situations, not just as isolated rules and regulations. The exam measures your ability to apply floodplain management knowledge to solve problems and make regulatory decisions. Understanding the underlying principles and their practical application is more important than memorizing specific details. Focus on understanding the why behind the regulations, not just the what. This understanding will help you answer exam questions that present scenarios you have not seen before, but that require application of fundamental principles. Good luck with your exam. Remember that FEMA 480 certification demonstrates your competence in one of the most important areas of hazard mitigation and community resilience. The knowledge you have gained will help protect lives and property in flood-prone communities across the nation. This completes your comprehensive FEMA 480 study guide. You now have all the essential information needed to understand the National Flood Insurance Program and pass your certification exam. The guide covers every unit in detail while maintaining focus on the most critical and frequently tested concepts.